Welcome everyone to our discussion about poetry to mark April, which is National Poetry Month. I'm Ann Bile and I will be your host, and we have with us two poets. And you know what? They are going to introduce each other. Amy, you go first and introduce Denise.
Okay. Well, I am pleased to introduce my friend, Denise Vredevoogd, who is a Breathe Planning Committee member. Denise has been our hospitality coordinator for these many years, and we appreciate so much all that she does to keep us on our toes and keep us just doing what we need to do to give our attendees the best experience possible at Breathe. Denise is also a very gifted poet. I've had the joy of reading her work and publishing her work in Exhale. And her day job as a piano teacher keeps her from writing more poetry. So we all have our day jobs, right? But Denise, it's a joy to be here with you today and talk about this poetry that we love so much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Amy. And I consider you a dear friend too, not just a fellow poet and member of the planning committee, but I also have appreciated over the years sitting next to you at the Festival of Faith and Writing, listening to one of our favorites, Lucy Shaw, and just talking about words. And your work is wonderful. And I'm just so proud of the way you continue to write and revise and then to submit. Your latest accomplishment was in the Windhover, right? The Windhover
Correct. Yes.
Literary Journal, which I have frequently read and admired, and I'm just so excited that that you are a part of that.
Thank you. Thanks, Denise.
So welcome to Denise and Amy. Amy Nemecek, we should make sure everyone knows her last name, and Denise Vredevoogd. Tell me, Denise, about the first poem you ever wrote. Do you remember writing that poem? And then tell us too about the first time you saw your name in print with a published poem.
This was back when I was probably only 11 or 12 years old. And I wrote a poem for a contest for Calvinettes. I don't know, some of you might remember Calvinettes was it was a church girls club, kind of like Girl Scouts. And they were hosting this contest for poetry. And I actually got $5 for having this poem that I wrote published in their magazine. It was called In Touch, but my poem was titled His Touch. And it was a very intimate spiritual poem about my relationship at that young age with God. And here's a kind of an embarrassing truth about that poem. I wrote it in the bathroom, sitting on the white throne, because I grew up in a busy family. And that was one of the places I could find quiet and privacy. And I still remember sitting on the closed toilet seat, just jotting out the lines to that poem.
Denise, that is a beautiful story and a classic
story.
Child needing space story. Amy, tell us about your first poem that you wrote and how you got published the first time.
Yeah, I remember the first poem I remember writing was in third grade, Mrs. Barber's class, and you do your language arts unit on poetry, right? We were writing haiku and cinquain, and well, we had to write couplets, and I wrote, this is my couplet, okay? This was it. The biggest tree that I could see fell in the creek just last week. That's the first poem I remember putting to paper. And do you know they printed it in our little Christian school newsletter that went out each month? I had that one and a poem on fall, which I can't remember. I just remember it was about fall. and so that I was hooked. I saw, you know, I remember my mom showing her friends that little newsletter and my name in print, and I was kind of hooked. But the first poem, like serious poem that I ever had published was when I was in college, and I submitted a poem to our literary journal at Cornerstone, and kind of forgot that I had sent it in, and then at awards ceremony at the end of the semester, found out that it had won first prize and was published in the journal there. So, and I've just kind of been, it sort of affirmed that, yeah, I can do this. I love to do this, and yeah, it was a good experience. I've been doing it ever since.
It never gets old, does it?
No, it really, it's like a adrenaline rush, right? And then you want another hit. Yeah. So,
well, as long as we're talking to you, Amy, you guys have both written poetry over the years. Tell us, Amy, a little bit about your process, and then I'll ask you the same thing, Denise. Do you have a process? Is there a process?
It's interesting because I don't think I have a process other than it usually starts with an image or maybe one line.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's the first line or the last line, but the poem will come together around that image or that line. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis talked about when he was a young man in his undergraduate days at Oxford. He had this image come to him of a faun in a wood holding an umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And only years later did that image come to fruition as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But that's how it started, was that one image. And that's how a poem often starts for me.
Mm-hmm.
The other process, if you want to call it that, is sometimes I have a story that I really want to tell. And that's often stories from my childhood or from my ancestors, things I've learned about them. And I want to be able to tell that story in as few words as possible, but still have it be a punchy, meaningful story for a reader. So, yeah.
That's interesting to start with an image or a line and go from there. What about you, Denise? How do you create a poem? Do you have a process or a beginning?
Mine usually starts with an experience, like something that I have witnessed or seen, or like simple things like working in the garden will prompt, just a kind of a compulsion to, oh, I have to write about this. You have an insight, an idea, some way that what you're doing is connected to something larger. And it's like, I have to write this down, because if I don't, I'm not going to remember it.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so if I just jot a few lines down, it kind of starts like that. Or maybe it's just a phrase, or like Amy said, an idea or an image of something. And then, so once I get little snippets down, I don't always write it right away. I may come back to it weeks later, and then start putting more flesh on those, those bones of words, and just start experimenting with it. And that's the fun part too, because I rewrite a lot, because I'll think, I don't like the way that sounds. There has to be a better word, or I read it and think there's not much of a sense of rhythm to this. So, what other word could I use, or could I rearrange these lines? So the process it's not the same, obviously, for every poem or every type of poem. So, if it's a form poem I've decided to use, then, that gives me some concrete pattern to use. And like if it's a villanelle, or if I decide to do a sestina, and choose 6 key words. So, the form kind of determines too what the process is going to be.
And that's kind of is a nice segue into my next question, Denise, is, are there particular rules to follow when you're writing poetry? And you talk about rules within the particular forms. Maybe you can talk about that. Are there certain things that a poet must do or should do, all of which are really icky words when it comes to poetry, but there are probably some things that you need to follow, some rules to follow.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't like the rules either, but sometimes they really help
Mm,
to, if you didn't have to find a rhyming word, or if you didn't have to find a certain number of syllables, um, well, that's considered free verse, and free verse is fun too. And I would say that's probably the majority of my poems, free verse. Um, and are there rules to follow for that? No, other than it needs to have a sense of balance and rhythm. And it still has to sound good, and it still has to have continuity and all that. But no, it's free. It means there are no real boundaries or restrictions. But yes, if you choose a form, then sometimes being forced to think of that allows you, you know, I don't know, it's kind of ironic because there's that paradox of having boundaries which give you more freedom.
mhm, mhm.
So
Yeah.
What about you, Amy?
Um, I tend to think of them as boundaries, not rules. And especially when I'm stuck, sometimes because Denise is right. When you're writing free verse, the sky's the limit. I mean, you can experiment, you can do, strange and wonderful things with words.
mhm.
But sometimes when you get stuck, it does help to narrow your boundaries. In one of our Breathe workshops several years back, Matt Landrum talked about he talked about line. We were talking about specifically about line length and line breaks, because sometimes it's hard to know where to break a line of poetry and run it down, right? And so he had a prof who would literally draw a box of a certain size, and each stanza had to fit in a box of that size. So it was usually 4 lines. And if your line, when your line got to that right margin, you ran it down, and then you played around with that a little bit, but it was keeping it in that golden box, right?
Mhm.
Which I found fascinating, and I've tried doing that. And the crazy thing is it's worked. It's worked for me in some settings. But I always go back to what my college professor used to tell me as a young writer when I was trying to break rules. And she would say, Amy, you have to know the rules of language, and only once you know them are you allowed to start breaking them. Which she was telling me I didn't know them as well as I thought I did. And once I learned them better, then she started saying, okay, spread your wings, start breaking some rules. And yeah, I think poetry still needs to make sense.
Mhm.
I have read poetry that does not make sense. I'm not going to call it bad poetry, because I don't think, it made sense to that person who wrote it. But I do think that it needs to have meaning for a reader as well, not just for me who wrote it.
Mhm.
And maybe I'm wrong on that, but I feel like if it doesn't make sense to anyone but me, then what's the point?
Yeah,
for me?
that's in itself is a good point.
Yeah.
I think about those line breaks because for years I wrote headlines for a newspaper. And
Yeah.
how do you break a headline
Oh,
into
right.
4 lines?
Right.
There's some similarities to poetry in how you
That's
break a
interesting.
headline.
Yes.
It's much less artistic, but there's some of those still some of those thoughts about it. Well, let's talk about some of your favorite poets. When you think about those who maybe have broken the rules or who do well within the boundaries,
Okay.
who would you say some of your favorite poets are, Amy?
There's so many, Anne, but I did try to narrow it down when I was thinking about this. Seamus Heaney was an Irish poet. I love his use of language, his imagery. He could write form quite well. In fact, he translated the Old English poem Beowulf. It's the best translation because he kept it in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I also love Ted Kooser. You know who's really cool is Kwame Alexander, and I know he crosses genres. He does,
Mm-hmm.
but like he does poems that are novels or
Mm-hmm.
novels that are poems. And I love his style. It's so cutting edge. Mary Oliver, Madeline L'Engle is an excellent example of someone who stays in the boundaries of form.
Mm-hmm.
All her poetry is form poetry. Sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, and maybe this will segue into Denise because I know we both share a love of Lucy Shaw. Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned that day at the Festival of Faith and Writing, that was just the best day, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. To be able to sit and listen to Lucy read, and going into her 90th year. I think we were celebrating her 90th birthday that year. So yes. So who are some of your favorites, Denise?
Well, I was thinking about that too, like you did, trying to narrow it down. I would say of the older poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins. I really appreciate his poet. And you're probably familiar with the spring one, his spring poem. And he played with words a lot.
Yeah.
And created his own words. And, and he wrote in form too.
He did, yes.
I love his poems. I have tried to copy like the line. I turned his spring poem into a summer poem, and just use the number of syllables and try to get the same kind of feel. It's just fun to try to imitate those you appreciate and enjoy. And yes, Lucy Shaw, Mary Oliver, the two that you've mentioned too. Yeah. Jean Murray Walker is another one, a contemporary poet.
Yes.
Who I really admire. She's done an entire book of very contemporary sonnets, and it's very unique, and that's like cutting edge too.
Yeah, I agree. That's an interesting one because it doesn't necessarily follow conventional sonnet form. Like you can't pin it to, okay, this is a Petrarchan sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet or a Spenserian sonnet. They are all sonnets. They're 16 lines. So you're right. That's a really interesting book.
Any other ones, Denise?
Let's see. John Blaze. I have a little one by him. I like to take these tiny little books with me. They're so easy, they try. I almost always, if we're on a plane, will take a small poetry book like this, somebody's chat book or whatever, because it's just so relaxing to me to just sit and open a poetry book and just, sit with a poem for a while. And it's something not like a novel where you just really get lot tied into. It's just something you can pick up and put down. And so I have quite a collection of Barbara Crooker is another one. I like her.
I also have to give a shout out to Billy Collins. He was America's Poet Laureate he's phenomenal, and I'm actually right in the middle of his brand new one that just came out in 2020. He published a new collection, and it's called Whale Day, and he's just witty and funny, but also some of his poems are just so, they hit you right in the heart. Like they're beautiful.
So here's a question that you maybe not have prepared for.
Uh-oh.
But why why should people even read poetry who are not poets? So I tend to write magazine articles and in nonfiction. And what's the benefit of reading poetry? Do you have a thought on that, Amy?
To quote John Keats, a thing of beauty is a joy forever.
What about you,
And
Denise?
yeah, it is beautiful.
Mhm.
I think it's good for opening your eyes and minds to a different way of looking at things, because I think the best poems will take something very common, ordinary, tangible, and pull some connection to another larger truth, something that's universal.
Mhm.
Going from the common to the extraordinary. And I think that even if you don't write poetry, you can appreciate that
Absolutely.
and learn from it, and see that there are other ways of looking at things.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's good advice for people who maybe don't think of poetry that way. They think of it as dense or hard to understand, but you're right. It opens our eyes to look at things in a new way.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the way we're taught poetry when we are young people in school, in our language arts classes, we're taught to break it down and, just tear it apart and critique it. That's not what it's about.
Mhm.
It's about, we lose the joy of reading it when we do that. So we beat it to death almost. So just to read it and enjoy it, just read it for its own sake, and to see how words are put together, how sounds are put together, I think is really important to any writer, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, memoir. You don't have to be a poet to read it.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would you say your best piece of advice is for a beginning poet? Somebody who says, I love poetry, I love reading it, I want to start writing it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they're sort of in the process. And what would you say is a good piece of advice?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you want to start writing poetry, you have to read poetry.
Mm-hmm.
You have to read classic poetry. The Gerard Manley Hopkins, going all the way back to John Milton, John Donne, two of my favorites. Read classic poetry, Robert Browning, romantic poetry. So read it, learn the rules, right? And then my second piece of advice is, if you haven't already, fall in love with words and fall in love with the sound of words, the way they look on a printed page, the way they can be put together, and you can take them apart and put them together a different way and they sound different. So fall in love with words.
What about you, Denise?
To kind of tag on to what Amy said, to take things apart and put them together, it's a process. You can't expect as a beginning poet just to sit down and write a poem. You need to be willing to work with it. And I know, Anne, you love to do puzzles. Sometimes I think about a poem as doing a puzzle, trying to see which word fits the best place. Where is it going to go to make the most sense? So yeah, just like Amy said, read a lot, different forms, different poets, find what you like, what feels comfortable for you to start writing, and then just go for it. Just have fun experimenting.
Would you say, Denise, to not be discouraged if it doesn't work out the first, second, or fifth time?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So I have poems that I've written, years ago. I'll go back and think, why did I say it that way? And then get an idea for changing it. So, yeah.
Well, do you have a couple of places that you would suggest poets submit, Denise? And I'll ask you the same question, Amy. Where would be good places to submit poems for publication?
I'm not the best one to ask about this because I'm not, I'm not really much of a submitter. Uh, I should be, I would like to be. That's something I'm working on. Um, I have to stop being such a perfectionist, I guess, and just do it. You know, I like to revise and play with them and think it's never finished. Um, but so I'm going to let Amy answer this question because I know that she has done a lot more submitting than I have.
Yeah, I haven't recently. My day job kind of takes precedence lately. But one thing I wanted to mention, Denise, you talk about being a perfectionist, and that's one of my just innate character traits, I guess. Sometimes it's a blessing, often it's a curse.
Mhm.
So even when I get a poem published, sometimes I'll go back to that poem a year later and I'll think, oh, I want to change that word. I didn't like the way that word looked on the page or the way it sounded when someone else read it out loud. So I'm constantly tinkering too, even with stuff that's been published. As far as where to submit, I think a really good place to start is Submittable. You can just go to submittable.com. I think you have to you can create a free account, like register, and that will enable you to just browse by genre. So you would just put the filter on that you want poetry journals. And there's other filters you can apply, but just browse through there, see what's, you can browse by deadline, what are the most, what deadlines are coming up the soonest, right? And you should also maybe go to your library. If I know the Grand Rapids Public Library has quite a few poetry journals that they have subscriptions to. You want to read different journals to find out what might be a good fit for your work, because not every journal is going to be a good fit. And so do your homework, you know, find out which journals you really like. I've always wanted to be published in Ruminate, always. They have rejected me so many times. I had a reader note published one time in Ruminate, and that to me was a huge deal. And so, but yeah, I mean, and then just keep, you know, being persistent. You can also join some Facebook groups. There are poetry groups on Facebook where they'll say, hey, such and such journal is taking submissions right now. You can follow some of those journals on Facebook, on social media. They'll let you know when their submission deadlines are. Mm-hmm. And so it's just kind of keeping your ear to the ground, but Submittable is always a really good place to start. And yeah.
And there are the Writer's Digest, Poets Market Guide, Poetry Market Guide.
Yes, there is.
And then,
well, there's a whole Poets and Writers magazine.
Yes.
That you can scan through. And that is one that most libraries have subscriptions to.
Mm-hmm. So magazines, even the Writer's Market Guide has a section for poetry.
It does.
And the Christian Writer's Market Guide, which I read for fun, both of those sometimes, which speaks to my reading, but we won't talk about that. But both of those, Christian Writer's Market Guide and just the general market writer's market, will have listings for poetry. And it's not necessarily just a magazine for poets. It could be a general market magazine that occasionally publishes poetry.
Correct.
Or Sunday school papers, or there's a lot of options that you can go and look through as reference tools first.
Right. I'm thinking of just like the Christian Century is a Christian magazine that, you know, publishes regular articles and book reviews, but they also include usually about a half dozen poems in each issue. Plow is another one that I really love. Plow. So yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, they're not all. It's not just literary journals that publish poetry.
Yeah. So there's a lot of avenues for poets to publish their work.
Yeah.
Pay is probably not astronomical, but that's
It's
okay.
usually most poets, it's non-paying markets for the
Mhm.
most part. Though you might get enough for, a cup of coffee at Big B. I've been paid, but yeah, seriously, they'll like pay me on PayPal. They'll give me like $5 or $10, and I can go buy myself a coffee.
So really that initial poem you got published when you were very young is about what you're getting paid now also.
Wow, I'm not, yeah, come a long way, baby.
Yeah. So then here's a final question for you all as we talk about people write poetry because they love it. What do you love about writing poetry? Do you have some thoughts on that, Denise? What do you love about it? What makes you do it?
I enjoy the process. Just like I said earlier, just like you enjoy puzzles, I enjoy working with words, and I like puzzles too, though.
Yeah,
But
you do.
yeah, but I just love, like we mentioned before, the way a word sounds, um, and trying to put them together in such a way that it's a challenge. So it's yeah, I guess I like the challenge of it,
Mhm.
but I also like the reward of it, of having finished it, and then sometimes going back to it after letting it sit for a long time and thinking, wow, that does sound kind of cool. And it's almost like, did I write that?
Yeah.
So it's inspirational, and for me, it's also devotional. It's just it can be a way to worship, turning like a written prayer into a poem style. It's a way to express myself, like any other creative endeavor. It's just something that, yeah, um, it's rewarding, and yeah, that's why I enjoy it.
Good. Thank you. What about you, Amy?
Yeah, I resonated a lot with what Denise said there. Really, for myself, it is a spiritual practice. I consider it a spiritual discipline almost, because quite often as I'm writing a poem, that the way the words go together and the ideas that go together, it's forming me. Quite often I'll start writing a poem and it'll end up someplace that I wasn't expecting. And then I'll have to step back and say, yeah, wow, okay, that's what's really going on inside me. And I didn't even know it until I saw it, until I read what I had put on the page. And so, yeah, for me, it helps me clarify my thoughts. Sometimes my thoughts go a million miles a minute, and so many, I'm trying to multitask and do this and do that. And I'm always working with words. I work at, full time as a book editor. So words are just constant. And sometimes they're like a swarm of bees in my head, and writing a poem helps quiet the swarm of bees. It's like, how the beekeeper puts some smoke on the bees to just settle them down. That's what poetry does for me. It just, okay, let's collect our thoughts, condense them, simplify them, and get them down on paper, and then step back, read it, and say, okay, that's what's in my heart. That's what's going on inside me. Yeah.
And that is a great way to end our discussion. So I so appreciate your time, Amy and Denise. And we are excited. I feel like I want to go read some poetry now. And we look forward to more in National Poetry Month. So thank you again.
Yeah.